It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I enjoy doing this presentation. I certainly wish I would have known about the Genealogy Center 4 years ago when I started down this path that ended up with this book. I actually did not learn about it until recently, and I'm just amazed at the resources of the Genealogy Center. So let's start. You can see those are my email addresses. If you have any comments to me afterwards or any questions, please feel free to send me an email. The Madness of John Terrell, Revenge and Insanity on Trial in the Heartland. Melvin Wolfe was a mean, nasty, cheating son of a bitch and the handsomest man I ever saw. Right up to the day my pa put a shotgun against his head and blew his brains all over Doc Saunders' office. Blew him straight to hell. Guess he blew the rest of our lives to hell too. Lucy Terrell Johnson. So begins the madness of John Terrell. It's a story of three people. John Terrell, my great uncle, was a farmer, a rich oil man, a businessman, an atheist, and a father. His youngest daughter, Lucy Terrell, 19-year-old scorned woman, abused wife, mother, and daughter. And Leo Melvin Wolfe, the cat of Wells County, a father, estranged husband, and victim. So, back in March 2020, we had a pandemic. I don't know if any of you out there remember that, but I had recently retired, and we, of course, all found ourselves at home and trying to find something to do. And I figured I would work on my family tree. I'd done some family research before, and I decided now was the time to do a little more in-depth research. So my genealogy search, this is the Terrell family tree, two parts of it. And as I did my research, if you look on the left side of the screen, the lower right-hand corner, you'll see my name, Stephen Terrell. And you'll see some of my siblings and their spouses along the line. Not all of them, by the way. There are 7 siblings in my family. The next line up on the left in blue, you see Thomas Terrell, who was born in 1900. That was my father. Above that, on the left side, you see William U. Terrell. That was William Ulysses Grant Terrell. He was born 3 years after the end of the Civil War, hence his name, and he was always referred to as Grant. Unfortunately, he died prior to my being born, so I never knew him, but I learned a lot about him over the years. And then his father is on the far left of the top line, William Wesley Terrell, who was born in 1829, my great-grandfather. He was also, as far as I can tell, the first Terrell born in the state of Indiana. Next to him is Mary Ann Thornburg, who was my great-grandmother. But what I found as I did my research, I discovered that William was married before he was married to my great-grandmother. And that's what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. The screen to the right, if you look on the top line, you'll see, again, William Terrell, the same guy that's over on the left. But this time, his wife is listed as Rebecca Thornburg. If you note, that's the same last name as his second wife. Rebecca and Mary Ann were first cousins. And they were married in 1849, it's my recollection. And underneath that, you'll see they actually had 2 children. The one son they had, John W. Terrell, he is the person about whom this book was written. Born in 1852, However, his mother died in 1854 when he was about 18 months to 2 years old. My grandfather then remarried. That's what you see on the left-hand side of the screen, about a year and a half or 2 years after Rebecca died. John is the subject of this book. If you look down the next line, you will see his daughter Lucinda on the far right. As you go along, you'll see her two husbands. And then to the left, you will see Mary L. Terrell. That is Mary Lucy Terrell. She never went by the name Mary. It was always Lucy. And her husband, the other person of the three that we talked about in that first slide, Leo Melvin Wolfe, known as Mel. And it's their story that we're going to talk about. But I did not know anything about John Terrell when I first saw his name. And that was in this pandemic period when I was doing my research. All I knew was that he was born in 1852 and he died in 1916. So I, being an old newspaper reporter before I was a lawyer, I always loved using newspapers.com. And so I typed in John's name and the date or the time frame that he died and searched for news stories about his death notice. And as any of you who do genealogy seriously know, death notices contain an awful lot of information. That's where you can find some really intriguing facts about a person, a death notice or obituary. So I searched for that in the Central Indiana newspapers on newspapers.com. And what I found left me stunned and more than a bit intrigued. This is the story, the very first story that popped up when I did my search. You'll see John W. Terrell succumbs here. Wells County man who murdered son-in-law dies at home of daughter. Crime occurred in 1903. And then the story with the death at 9 o'clock this morning of John W. Terrell, 63, at the home of his daughter, Mrs. Lucy Terrell Johnson in Muncie, Indiana, there was written the final chapter in one of the most noted criminal cases in Wells County and the state of Indiana, a case in which John Terrell in 1903 shot and killed his son-in-law, Melvin Wolfe. This was a story of all the family stories that were passed down in my family. This was a story of which nobody had ever spoken. That one article led to more than 3 years of research. Research included the Indiana State Archives, the Indiana State Library, the Wells County Public Library, Bracken Library at Ball State University, Wells County and Randolph County Historical Societies, Wells and Randolph County Clerks, Auditor, Recorder, the Judge's Office in Wells County, histories of Randolph, Wells, and Delaware counties, online research, Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com among them. And of course, in the cemeteries in Wells, Adam, and Randolph counties. In doing this, I want to go back a little bit about my family because this all led to the research of John's murder of his son-in-law, but also led me to track down the history of my family all the way back to the time they first came to Indiana in 1827, and even before that, when the Terrell side of the family came from the state of Virginia. These are land grants that I found from George Wesley Terrell, who was William Wesley Terrell's father, and from his brother Drummond when they acquired property for the first time in the state of Indiana. I used, obviously, census reports, and here are two of them that were important to me, particularly in this case. The one on the left is from 1880. That is just shortly after John Terrell and his wife, Catherine, moved to Wells County, Indiana, where all these events in this book took place. But what's important, and I'm not asking you to read those, they're very faint, but They showed John and his wife and their two young daughters, their oldest children, ages 2 and 1 at the time of the census. And they were living with John's great uncle, Drummond, who had moved to Wells County, actually had bought the farms in Wells County in early 1880 and then transferred them a few months later to John. The one on the right shows the same family. It shows Drummond and his wife, then Sarah, who were living at the time in Randolph County, Indiana. And it shows them not with their son, but with 7-year-old John. And this shows something I found fascinating in my research, which appears to some extent in the book, but I found out through talking with people at the Randolph County Historical Society about this, because John was not living with his father. Remember, his father had remarried by this time, but the Historical Society indicated to me that it was not unusual, and if you understand the times, for a husband, when his wife died, a farmer like William Wesley Terrell was, when his wife died, the children were divided up among other people in the family. And John went to his great uncle and his uncle's wife, who were childless. But when William married my great grandmother, Mary, they did not take the children back. And I found that very unusual, but yet in talking with the people at the Historical Society, they said it was not that unusual that when children were given away to other family members at the time a mother died, that when the husband remarried, that they would not take back the children from the first marriage, which I found rather amazing. So the census obviously were helpful in tracking down this information. They were also really helpful in tracking down information about the participants in the trial. And we'll get to that later. But I looked up a lot of the census reports to try to find information about the jurors who sat on the trial and the lawyers who tried the case, and found it was, while not all of that ended up in the book, I just found it was really helpful to get that type of background to tell a story. One of the things about John, I found this through newspapers and then did a lot of research, particularly at the Bracken Library at Ball State, about the great oil boom, the gas boom and oil boom that hit Indiana, particularly in the 1890s to early 1900s. And what I found out about John was in 1892, oil was discovered on his Wells County farm. By 1896, there were 6 producing oil wells on John's farm. And it was fascinating. Through this, and then through his business acumen, he became perhaps the richest man in Wells County, because he was not only an oil man and a farmer, but he also used that money to make shrewd investments. He bought farms, he bought business property, he loaned out money, which wasn't casual, with documents such as mortgages and liens. And he never hesitated to enforce those by filing lawsuits. And if you look at this chart on the left, these are all lawsuits that I was able to find in the clerk's office of Wells County. I actually found the files on most of them. Some of the cases just had the case name and what it was about, but did not have the file itself. But those are all lawsuits that John Terrell filed against people between the mid 1890s and the early 1900s. So he was a sharp, shrewd businessman who was not to be dawdled with. But what I found about John and his family was that wealth did not bring happiness. the two oldest sisters, Lucinda and Sarah. The reason I say that, I hesitate there, is because Sarah was always called Sally. Lucinda was always called Cinda. They both married oil roughnecks, the guys working out on John Terrell's oil wells. And they married them in 1895 and 1896. They married brothers, Jacob Vandergriff and Ben Vandergriff, who came from Warren, Indiana, which is this small town. This is a very rural area of Indiana. Warren is a small town, still there, in the next county over from southwestern Wells County. But both daughters were abused. And within 10 years, they had been abandoned. Both were abandoned by their husbands, and they were both pregnant at the time. Both returned home. So this wealthy man, who you think would have the world on a string, has his two daughters, married daughters, returning home where they had been physically and mentally and emotionally abused by their husbands and then abandoned when they were pregnant. Lucinda's baby was stillborn. John had to pay medical bills and burial expenses. I found that information in the trial transcript we'll talk about later. And by 1899, both sisters were divorced. So now we come to Lucy and Melvin. In 1901, John's youngest daughter, Lucy, who was by newspaper accounts the apple of his eye, met Leo Melvin Wolfe, a handsome son of a respected farmer and horse breeder, and also had some oil wells on his property. But by November of 1901, Lucy was pregnant. It resulted in a forced marriage, which is detailed in the book. However, the marriage didn't set well. Lucy went to live with Melvin and his family. And while it started okay for the first few weeks, ultimately, Melvin demanded that Lucy get an abortion, which she refused. Melvin then undertook to abuse Lucy to the point that she attempted suicide by taking laudanum. Laudanum was a common medication back then. You didn't need a prescription for it. It was a tincture of opiates and alcohol. But she survived the attempted suicide. He continued to abuse Lucy. And then on May 9, 1902, Melvin took Lucy back home, threw her out of his buggy while she was 7 months pregnant, and then threw her clothes all over the yard of the Terrell farm. Melvin continued to harass Lucy and abuse Lucy, but not just her, the entire Terrell family, until the events of July 12, 1903. It included doing such things as running the Terrell wagons off the road if he ran into them. It included spreading rumors around, telling people, older men in the community, about how he made Lucy perform oral sex. It included threatening Lucy's younger brother with a gun. Those events continued up until July 12, 1903. Now, this is a side note. For me, in doing the research about this book, there are so many little side notes and just fascinating things about the people and the times. You know, we're talking about turn of the century Indiana, 1900, 1903. We're talking about the people in this very rural area. But Melvin Wolfe, before he met Lucy, also got another young girl, Chloe Blair, a 15-year-old girl, pregnant. And they did not, her father did not force a marriage here. They did not charge Melvin with bastardy, which was a criminal offense back then. And instead, Chloe gave birth to a daughter, Gladys Wolfe, in 1902, I believe. The picture on the left, the tall girl in the white dress in the back, is Gladys. The woman in the lower left is Chloe, then Chloe Holloway. And it's a fascinating story that is just dropped into a footnote in the book, but I think it is fascinating that Simon Holloway, on the right in the picture on the left, married Chloe in 1904, and he took Gladys in as if she was his own child. Now, while she never formally changed her name from Gladys Wolfe, she was named in the family, and there's a newspaper pictures of her, and she's always referred to as Gladys Holloway. And in the middle is a letter which one of Gladys's relatives, a great grandson, provided to me, which explains her view. It's Father's Day 1956, when Gladys is about 54 years old. She wrote this, and she talks about her birth father, not using that term, but her birth father, who was shot and killed by John Terrell. And it tells sort of the version, of course, she had no memory of it, but it's a version of the story that she learned when she was a girl about what happened to her father. And the interesting little footnote to this, I just find it, I got a bit sense of joy out of this to see the notice on the right, which is the 60th anniversary of Simon and Chloe Holloway, the 15-year-old girl who got knocked up in a time when that wasn't a good thing to happen to you. I guess it never is, but that 15-year-old girl who ends up marrying and celebrated a 60th anniversary with the young man who married her when she had already had a child. And that's just such a positive thing to take from these shattering events that we're going to talk about. So we come to July 12, 1903. It's the day that changed the life of John Terrell and his entire family. In the late afternoon, Melvin Wolfe took a buggy ride with another couple with his stepsister sitting next to him. As they passed the farm, the Terrell farm, where John was out in the barnyard with his granddaughter, John and Melvin and Lucy's baby, who was about a year old at the time, was playing around him in the barnyard. And Melvin Wolfe pulls his wagon up near enough to John Terrell that he could hear him and yells out, "Hold up the bastard so I can see it." On the return trip, John stepped, well, let me tell you what happened. So let me read a little segment from the first chapter of the book, The Madness of John Terrell. John Terrell stood from where he was concealed among buckthorn, goldenrod, and thistle, revealing himself and the double-barrel shotgun he held in his hands. Still wearing his grimy undershirt and overalls, he was no more than 8 feet from Melvin's buggy. The first blast went off before John raised the gun level, scattering the shot in a cloud of dust, gravel, and steel pellets. The horse startled and reared its front legs, pawing at the air. Melvin pulled tight on the reins, trying to maintain control. Terrell cursed at his misfire. He took careful aim and squeezed the trigger again. This time, Terrell did not miss. The blast hit Melvin with the impact of a mule kick. The air went out of Melvin so fast he could not even yell. Melvin looked down. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle between his hip and knee. Countless holes perforated his trousers, spewing a river of red. He had seen that much blood only when slaughtering hogs. His leg would not move. Melvin knew shock was holding back the pain. He had seen that while hunting, but he knew the pain would soon come. Della, that's his stepsister, gulped in deep breaths, screamed, then screamed again. The horse reared again and took off at a gallop. Melvin could do nothing but look at his leg. Della grabbed the reins from where they had fallen from Melvin's hands. She pulled back enough to regain control of the horse, but not so much that she slowed its pace. Melvin was only vaguely aware of Della and her actions. The pain began to work through the shock and into Mel's consciousness. It was like nothing he had ever felt, not even when as a boy he got his foot under a fully loaded corn wagon. Holy Jesus, he never thought anything could hurt that bad. Mel, Della screamed breathlessly. Oh God, Mel, hold on. I'll get you to the doctor. Just hold on. A guttural groan was Mel's only response. He felt hard against her, his face already turning ashen. Their carriage flew by Clarence and Rosa at a dead run. Della did not see their startled looks. John Terrell watched the speeding buggy disappear down the road. He broke his shotgun open and pulled 2 more cartridges from the pocket of his overalls. He loaded them in the breech, then snapped the gun closed as he walked into his barn. His son-in-law's bay horse was waiting, still in its harness from the ride home from a family dinner an hour earlier. It was a plow horse to use in the field, but now John had another purpose in mind. Mumbling to himself, John led the horse from the barn and hitched it to his buggy. His pale blue eyes bulged and face flushed. John climbed into the buggy. With one hand holding the reins and the other hoisting the shotgun above his head, John gave a yell and the horse took off at full gallop. Dust clouds still hung in the air from where Melvin Wolfe's buggy had passed only minutes before. John drove his horse forward at a fearsome pace, heading toward the bustling town of Petroleum and the event that would forever change his life and the lives of everyone connected to him. When Della, driving the wagon with Melvin on board, arrived, a doctor and 3 other men heard her yelling for help. They ran outside the doctor's office, saw the carriage was full of blood, grabbed Melvin and took him out of the buggy and into the doctor's office, through the doctor's office, into the back room where there was an operating room with an operating table. Minutes later, John Terrell came storming into town with his shotgun. He went into the house, started into the doctor's office. 2 men were standing there, and John told them, God damn the man who stands between me and Wolfe. I'll kill him as sure as I'm going to kill Wolfe. And with that, 2 men stepped aside. John went to the door to the operating room that had been locked. However, the operating room had a back door, and the doctor and his friend who were inside left out the back door, one running right, one running left, leaving Melvin Wolfe laying on the operating table. John took the barrel of his shotgun, battered down 2 of the planks in the plank door. Melvin apparently was trying to escape, even though he could not walk on that leg. He raised up enough that John shot him through the shoulder blade with the pellets, steel balls going into his heart and lungs. He fell back, and being a Terrell and a family trait of making sure that whenever we start a job, we finish it, John put the shotgun against Melvin Wolfe's head and pulled the trigger. The next day, my research found more than 600 stories in newspapers across the country. Big, bold headlines, slain while surgeon was using knife. Horrible way of revenge. You notice that's a German language paper from Indianapolis that made headlines. Terrell expresses no sorrow for the deed, and maybe my favorite, blew off head of son-in-law. Wells County man murders daughter in tragical style. Was on surgeon table. So, oh, and interesting, they weren't always 100% accurate, because it also says, as several papers said, that the operation, the amputation of Melvin Wolfe's leg was in process. It was not. And that is shown by testimony of the doctor at trial, but it made a great headline. So this story's made, as I said, headlines in more than 600 papers across the country the next day, including the front page of the New York Times. So I also made great use of death certificates. I found those to be extremely useful in doing my research, but none more useful than the death certificate of Melvin Wolfe. And you see it in front of you, where it lists the chief cause of death as gunshot wound, homicide. It says gunshot, homicide, duration, instant. These were very useful also to find out things about what happened to people eventually involved. Again, people like Dell, his stepsister, his father, who outlived many of the people that were involved in this case, and numerous other people. I just found death certificates to be full of so much information about what became of people, where they lived, what ailments they ended up suffering from. That's just my own personal view about it. So why did this shooting make the nation's headlines? This was a time of yellow press, and many of you have probably heard that term before. But one of my favorite descriptions of yellow press was it was described as florid bloom of crime and underwear. The yellow press grew out of the fight between, primarily the fight between the William Randolph Hearst newspapers and those newspapers of Joseph Pulitzer, particularly their newspapers in New York City. But it impacted the way news and particularly crime stories were covered all across the country. This story hit all of the magic notes that you look for. There's another quote up there too. It was about William Randolph Hearst papers wanted readers to look at page 1 and say, gee whiz, and turn to page 2 and exclaim, holy Moses. And then at page 3, shout, God Almighty. And that's exactly what this story did across the country. It was a story that had illicit love, an abandoned mother and child, a father's revenge, a roadside ambush followed by a chase, and a death by shotgun in the doctor's office. Who could ask for more? This story took place, which should identify this. If you look at the map on the left, that's a map of Indiana. And for those of you not familiar, there's an arrow pointing to Bluffton and Wells County. Bluffton is the county seat. If you notice, right above that is Allen County, home of the Allen County Genealogy Center in Fort Wayne. So this is right in that part of the state of Indiana, in north central Indiana. Over on the right is a map that I obtained from the recorder's office in Wells County. It's a map from about 1905, so it's the same time period. You can see Bluffton at the top. That's the county seat, which is in the center of Wells County. And then 9 miles south of there is a little town called Petroleum. Petroleum is essential to understanding this story because that at the time was a boom town. That got its name from the oil boom. And those farms around that area, you see around Petroleum, where the Noah Wolfe farm was, where John Terrell's farm was, those areas were filled with newly rich people, and they platted out this town of Petroleum. At the time, it had 2 doctors, it had a barber, it had a restaurant, it had an ice cream parlor, It had a stable, which was owned by John Terrell, although he leased it out to someone else. It was a bustling town. And in the story, one of the fascinating things is what happens the night before the shooting. John Terrell went into petroleum at 10 o'clock at night looking for a friend of his. And the town was bustling. People were full. The barber shop was full. There were people in the restaurant. It's not the dull, sleepy, rural America that we think of where the sidewalks roll up when the sun goes down. We look over a close-up of that area shows where petroleum was located. And then the Noah Wolfe farm, Jacob Noah Wolfe, it's located there, you say J.N. Wolfe, and that was about 2 miles and just a little bit south of petroleum. And John Terrell's farm was about 1.25 miles south of petroleum. If you look at his farm, you'll see it's C. Terrell. That's because after the shooting, John transferred ownership to his wife, Catherine. A fascinating thing that you can find if you dig into newspapers that you may not expect. I certainly never expected to find photos of the crime scene. These were run in a local newspaper. The one on the left shows the Camden Bluffton Pike, which is the road where John ambushed Melvin. If you look closely, you'll see a little X. That is where John jumped up out of the bushes at the side of the road, the ditch at the side of the road. And the circle is where Melvin supposedly was at the time he was actually shot. On the right is that operating table I talked about, where Melvin Wolfe was laying and was fatally wounded. If you look behind, you can see 2 black diagonal or rectangles. That's where John knocked the wood out of the door, the wood planks out of the door with the barrel of his shotgun, and then did the coup de grace, shooting Melvin in the head. And you can even see the board leaning against the wall, one of the planks out of the door. And I was just absolutely amazed to find this in newspaper accounts. I just didn't think we'd see crime scene photos. As I mentioned earlier, John was one of the wealthiest men, if not the wealthiest man in Wells County. And this part of the story, between his arrest, there was no manhunt, he voluntarily gave himself up. But as trial approached, this article, full-page article, ran in the Indianapolis Sunday Sentinel. It gives you an idea of the scope of this. Remember, Wells County is up by Fort Wayne. It's some 100 and probably from downtown Indianapolis, probably 140 miles. At that time, that's really a long day's journey to get someplace. But this story was attracting attention. And the article, a great headline, financing his fortune in the shadow of the gallows. And this tells about John's millions of dollars. Now, that's probably an exaggeration. Best estimates are John's fortune was probably worth someplace in the range of maybe $50,000 to $100,000, which is still a very wealthy man. But in today's terms, I think that would come up to about $3.5 million, maybe. But this shows his schedule. John was friends with the judge, not the judge, the sheriff. He was allowed to move his safe and all of his important papers and his desk and his office chair and move them into the jail. If you look closely at this article, the picture in the center is actually the Wells County Jail at the time. And it sets out his schedule because John, on a daily basis in the morning, first of all, he had a stenographer. He hired a stenographer who would come in every day. John would meet with businessmen from the area, bankers, businessmen, people who handled money transactions, who anyway, those important business people would come into his office in the jail cell every day, every morning. In the middle of the day, his friends and family would meet. They would bring him dinner, as it was referred to then, his lunch meal, his midday meal. Then in the afternoon, and that's what this looks like, a tower is where is supposed to represent the jail. John had started just before this shooting took place. John had agreed to finance the new Bluffton Grand Opera House, and it was being constructed immediately across the street from the Wells County Jail. And so in the afternoon, he would get in his window, as is shown here, and yell out instructions to the work crews who were building the opera house across the street from the jail. And then in the evenings, he would then meet with his lawyers to discuss his case. And that was his average day in his jail cell for the 6 months between the shooting and the time the case went to trial. I mentioned the opera house. This is it. The one on the left is one of the few pictures of the actual opera house as it existed in Bluffton in Wells County. And on the right, you can see that's a picture or an image of a news story in the Fort Wayne Daily News about the decision to build this grand opera house in Bluffton. It had an architect from Chicago who is known around the country for building theaters. It was the description of it was to be very opulent, according to the descriptions. Doesn't look so much in the photo on the left, but that was taken obviously years later. Remarkably, in October, the sheriff allowed John Terrell to be taken out of the jail, released, walked across the street to where several hundred people were gathered, and he was able to lay the cornerstone for the Bluffton Grand Opera House. I'm not sure that would happen today with somebody accused of murder, but then again, who knows? I found this whole episode just to be fascinating, and there were lots of little stories about this that made this more than just a murder and a trial. Moving on, this is the key, I think, to writing this book. I don't know if I could have written it without this. As was indicated, I'm a retired attorney. I did a lot of appellate work over my 40-plus year career. I found the Supreme Court's decision, which we will talk about later, in John Terrell's appeal. And I knew if there was a Indiana Supreme Court decision, there had to be a trial transcript someplace. I just didn't know it would be like this. With the help of the Indiana Archives and the Indiana Supreme Court clerk, I located the trial transcript of John Terrell's trial. And that's a photo of it. That's a photo of the cover on the left and then the transcript itself. A lot of people ask me, they expect it to have been handwritten. They expect it to be perhaps very short. Obviously, this one isn't. This is by far, according to the archives, the people at the archives, this is by far the biggest transcript by magnitude. It's the biggest transcript they have from this time period. But if you look closely at the picture on the right, you can actually see this transcript looks exactly like transcripts when I was clerking at the Court of Appeals, when I was taking cases to the Indiana Court of Appeals and the Indiana Supreme Court. It's typed, the numbers are lined, there are page numbers at the bottom, there's a little note at the bottom that tells who the witness is for that testimony. It is remarkable that this looks very similar to what modern transcripts looked like, except up until just recent years when they became all electronic. The fact, though, it was 2,500 pages. And so, because it was thin paper, not quite onion skin, but not regular paper like we have in our documents today, and because it was bound in one volume, they would not take it apart and allow it to be scanned or copied. So what I had to do was I spent 2 weeks with very courteous people at the Indiana State Archives with my iPhone and scanned with PDF setting and scanned every page of that 2,500 page transcript. As I said, it took about 2 weeks. Among the things in that transcript is the indictment, which is very interesting. It reads much the same as many indictments would read today. But down at the bottom, you'll see an arrow pointing to something. And it is on that last line where it says, on the 12th day of July in the year, and then I don't know if you are still doing this. It looks to me like somebody probably was still used to typing 1800. And I don't know if you write 19 on your checks, if anybody uses checks anymore, but I actually have started to write 19 a couple of times when I'm writing the year on a check and then I have to change it. Well, it looks to me that's sort of what happened, because it's, if you look close, it says 18903 instead of 1903. Okay, don't think much about that. However, keep that in mind. I want you to remember that, because we're going to talk about that again later. So 1903, on November 30, the case goes to trial in Bluffton, Indiana, in the courtroom. Interestingly, a week from today, the sitting judge in that court, in that Wells Circuit Court, in that same courtroom, he and I are going to do a presentation about the actual trial of John Terrell in the same courtroom where my great uncle stood trial 121 years ago. I think that's going to be a fascinating experience. It certainly is going to be for me. The jury trial, 97 men were called as prospective witnesses who were questioned over nearly 3 days. Notice I said 97 men. Women were not permitted to be jurors at that time. A surprise to the judge, a bit of a surprise to me. When I say the judge, the current judge in that court, the number one reason to be excused from the jury for those 97 men was opposition to the death penalty. We think of that time being a time of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, rough justice. But in fact, it was the number one cause. Nearly half of the people called to that jury could not sit, because you have to be able to follow the law. And John, one of the options for John was death by hanging. And if a juror could not impose that, they could not sit on that jury. And that today is still the rule, at least it is in Indiana, and I think in most jurisdictions, that a person who is opposed to the death penalty cannot sit on a capital case. There were also 3 people who were excused from jury because they had typhoid fever at home. That I have never run into in my career. Remember, jurors were drawn from property rolls, not from voter rolls, not from the broader base we have today, certainly no women were involved. So the jury was drawn from property owners, which meant that it was an older jury, because people had to own property to be on the jury. So the youngest was 33, the oldest was 66, but all but 3 were 50 years old, were over 50 years old. An interesting fact, the jury was sequestered for 3 weeks. Did they send them to the local hotel, the local Holiday Inn? No, sir. They slept on cots in the courtroom for 3 weeks and didn't go home. So at the end of 3 days, there were finally 12 jurors, and they had 3 things in common. They were all men. They were all farmers. No merchants were selected. And they all believed in the death penalty. So the case went to trial. And while I don't have photos of the trial, I was fascinated to find they had courtroom artists. And on your left, you'll see a picture of John and his daughter Lucy, and just an image of Mabel, Lucy and Melvin's daughter, as they sat in the courtroom. Just a little side note, another one of those things that caught my attention particularly. Mabel had a rather tragic life. She ended up with cancer and died in about 1940 in her late 30s. The trial scene you see is the prosecutor is standing in the middle. To the left are John's lawyers with their heads askew. That's Arthur Sharp. And in the beard and hair, long beard, that's Mr. Gregory from Muncie, Indiana, who was brought in for the trial. Behind them sits John and Lucy. On the right is, if you look very closely, you see a gentleman with a beard there. That's Noah Wolfe, Melvin's father. Behind him is his stepmother, Mary Wolfe, whose dour expression seems to fit very much the personality that's conveyed in the testimony about the type of person she was. And right next to Noah Wolfe with the beard is a gentleman with a mustache, and that is Mr. Eichhorn, who is one of the assistant attorneys, and has showed to me that he was just a brilliant lawyer in this trial. The case, as I said, went on for 3 weeks, including night sessions and Saturday sessions. More than 100 witnesses were called to the trial. It had its moments, sad moments, when Melvin Wolfe's father, Jacob, who you see in this image, identified the clothes that Melvin was wearing with dried blood and bullet holes all through them. And those clothes were passed to the jury. It had dramatic moments, such as when John Terrell testified that Melvin Wolfe insulted him, saying about his granddaughter, "Hold up the bastard so I can see it." And then, according to John, it went night, and he had no recollection of the shooting or what followed the shooting. There were scandalous moments. Lucy testified in front of a packed courtroom and told about finding Melvin in bed with his stepsister, and Melvin trying to force Lucy to perform oral sex, only not in those terms. But it even had heartwarming moments, as when Mabel, Lucy and Melvin's 18-month-old daughter, wandered away from her mother and found her way to the prosecution table. Prosecutor John Burns, who you see standing in the center here, picked up the girl, hugged her, patted her on the back, then with a smile returned her to Lucy. A lot of these details, some of them come from the trial transcript, some of them come from the newspaper's accounts, which were much more extensive than we would see in the newspaper today. They were almost blow-by-blow descriptions of the entire trial, whether it was relevant or not. This is a part of the trial transcripts, and if you have a relative that you're looking up, if you're doing genealogy work and there's a trial in your family history that you want to learn more about, you need to be aware that not all trial transcripts are reduced to paper like this, are you can't find all of them. What has to happen almost inevitably, you have to have an appeal at some point. And it's when someone appeals that the record of proceedings is prepared, and then it is transferred to the court of the Indiana of the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. So if you just have a trial of somebody and you're trying to look at something and trying to trace down the history, it's very doubtful you're going to find a transcript unless there was an appeal. So for this case, this was one of the moments, probably not so important to the people who read the book, probably not so important to people who care about the murder trial and what happened. But for me, it's one of the most important things I found, because it is the actual words of my great-grandfather, William Terrell, and my great-grandmother, Mary Ann Terrell. And these are people who died long before I was born. William Terrell was born, as best I can tell, I mentioned earlier, he was the first Terrell born in the state of Indiana in 1829. And so I'm reading his words, and I'm reading my great-grandmother's words, and it is a very, very special, it's very special for me to see how they actually talked, how they dealt with the pressures of being in a courtroom where I later, 2-3 generations later, I made my living in those courtrooms. Two things I wanted to point out real quickly is the interesting answer to William Terrell, because remember I talked to you about the fact that his son, once his wife died, his son went to live with Drummond Terrell, a great uncle, and did not return when William and Mary Ann married 2 years later. At the bottom of the transcript on the page, the one on the left, line 18 and 19, the question is, what relation are you to the defendant, John W. Terrell? And the peculiar answer, I am said to be his father. The other part that was interesting about their testimony, and a couple of other witnesses, is they talked at length. They had to do with the insanity defense. And so the defense was putting up evidence of all these Terrells who had mental issues or may have had intellectual disabilities, just trying to get the jury to buy that John had become insane during this incident, because that was the defense. But one of the stories they told was about William's father, George Wesley Terrell. By the way, George Wesley Terrell and William Wesley Terrell were both preachers, founders of churches in Indiana, very involved in very religious, very fundamentalist religious. John was an atheist. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they talked about my great-grandfather great-great-grandfather, the first Terrell to step foot in Indiana, by actually knowing him and telling about his experiences. And they told the story of his youngest son, William's brother, but much younger brother, who in 1865 was killed in the Civil War 2 weeks before Lee surrendered to Grant. He was killed in North Carolina. And the story about his father, my great-great-grandfather, was after that happened, he was never the same again. And you can imagine that. But the defense was trying to create something that my great-great-grandfather falling apart because of the death of his youngest son could be attributed to some faulty gene in the Terrells that revealed itself when John shot Melvin Wolfe. The trial was also interesting because of the expert witnesses. There were a dozen expert witnesses called by the defense. And when I say expert witnesses, this is unusual for an expert witness at all to be called at a trial in 1900. And here there were 12 of them that were called by the defense. They were, for their time, experts in the sense that they studied in Europe. They studied at Bellevue Hospital in New York. Many of them were treating the insane at hospitals. So they were not just simply local doctors that they were asking opinions about. But these doctors were paid, it came out in evidence, were paid the sum of $100 a day for their testimony. And by all accounts in the newspapers, this simply led people in the courtroom to gasp, because the average annual income at this time was about $600 for one day. And they would have to travel from Indianapolis or Chicago or someplace else and then testify and then go back. They'd have to prepare for the case. So I'm sure it involved more than one day for each witness. For each of these people, one day would be the equivalent of the average person's 2 months' income. They testified about terms. This was pre-Freud, just on the cusp of Freud. So they testified about things like melancholia and melancholia agitated and melancholia senility, and talked about the cerebrum manifested by multitudes and other diagnoses that now seem as primitive as bloodletting. And they were trying to convince 12 farmers who were born, most of them around the time before the Civil War, who probably had very little education, just a month here or a month there to learn to read, write, and add. And they were trying to convince them through this testimony that basically, by all, again, newspaper accounts, probably no one understood. And certainly I'm sitting here 120 years later, and I don't understand most of what they're talking about. The questions, this was the other thing, is the questions were asked in forms of a required hypothetical question. That was the legal procedure then for getting an opinion from an expert witness. And the procedure on the right-hand side, you'll see one page of that question. The question was 16 pages long. And what happened is that the lawyer stood there and had, for each of those witnesses, had to read those 16 pages. It took 40 minutes on average to read that single question, to which it concluded was John Terrell of sound or unsound mind. And the answer was, from all of those experts, was unsound, and then they were subject to cross-examination. They were not allowed to explain their answer. If you take those 40 minutes times 12 witnesses, it meant that those 12 farmers sat there listening to the same repetitive question being read, droned on, for a total of 8 hours during the case. The case finally concluded. The judge permitted a stunning 8 hours of closing arguments for each side, 16 hours of argument. So after 3 weeks of testimony, including night sessions, Saturday sessions, a dozen experts, 16 hours of closing argument, the jury was sent out to deliberate at 9:30 p.m. on a Saturday night at the latter part of December. On Sunday morning, word came back that the jury, about 8:15 in the morning, that the jury had a verdict. It took less than 15 minutes. The jury only took a single vote and on guilt, and they found John guilty. There were 3 votes with regard to a sentence, because one of the people no votes were for execution. There was one person who wanted a lighter sentence than life in prison. ultimately, and that the whole deliberation took no more than 15 minutes, maybe 10. And they found him guilty, and that he should be imprisoned in state prison for life. John's only recorded response to the verdict was, "It's pretty strong." And there's the headline from the Bluffton Evening News on Sunday. It was a Sunday edition. Pretty good headline for the Times. One of the cool things I found, two of the cool things I found in doing this research, on the left-hand side is a photo of the Wells County legal community from about 1903. And I know it's about 1903 because the one gentleman on the left with the one on his that I put on to identify him is the sheriff. And of course, the sheriff's terms were limited in Indiana. That's James Johnston. And so we can be pretty sure this photo was taken about 1903, a year or a year one way or the other. The only people who are not in this, the prosecutor, who was actually from neighboring Blackford County, is not there. And the judge, the special judge who tried the case, the judge who handled it up until 2 weeks before trial, has number 5 on him. He was Judge Vaughn, Edwin Vaughn, and he handled the case right up until 2 weeks before trial, when John actually moved for a change of judge, claiming that Judge Vaughn was biased. And today, you couldn't ever wait that long to file such a motion. But when he did, the judge granted it, and probably not wanting to handle this trial himself, and named a judge from a neighboring county, Judge Smith, as the judge to handle the case. And he is not in this picture either because he's from neighboring Jay County. The photo, and that photo I found in the office outside of the courtroom, the Wells County courtroom as it stands today. That photo was on the wall in the office outside of the courtroom, which I found fascinating. I was just amazed to find it, and it did identify all of the people in the photo. The other photo, which was one of the last photos I found, was found in the Wells County Public Library. I did not find it, could not find it online, could not find it on Ancestry.com, or newspaperarchives.com or newspapers.com. Couldn't find it any of those places. But it is a photo of the actual jury that found John guilty and sentenced him to life in prison, plus the 2 men in front, because people ask that sometimes. There's 14 people in the photo. The 2 men in front are 2 of the bailiffs who handled the trial. So this is one of the fascinating parts of this story. That was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Start off with, if you find bizarre stories in this about John Delacour, was fascinating. I won't go into this because we're running long here. But John was the guy who ended up being the manager of the Bluffton Opera House, but he was also a lawyer. He didn't practice, but he was also a lawyer. And he ended up being involved in this. Afterwards, there was a story that he was dying out west because of bad lemonade. And I was able to track down the information about Charles Delacour. The fact that in 1907, he resurfaced in Los Angeles with his business partner, Fields, and they were building a theater in Los Angeles. There's the story of one of John's lawyers, Levi Mock, whose great-grandson still practices law in Bluffton, Indiana. Levi was, according to his great-grandson, and by all accounts at the time, someplace between 6'7" and 6'11", but generally recognized as 6 feet 10 inches tall, at a time when the average man was probably, 5'7"? He was a legal giant and a real giant in the courtroom. He ended up in a fee dispute with John just weeks before the trial and ended up withdrawing his appearance and just shortly before the trial, withdrew his appearance. And on the right, you see the summons because he sued John for their fee dispute. After the trial, in his cell, John went insane. At least that's the question. There was a division in the community. Was he faking it or not? He was ranting, banging, sleeping, banging his head, not eating, not going to the bathroom for 10 days at a time. And he ended up setting fire in that office he had in his cell. He ended up setting fire to the contents of that safe, including thousands of dollars, important contracts, deeds. And at that point, they brought him back into court. Lucy filed for a guardianship, and a guardianship jury found that he was insane. The judge in the trial court also called the jury in, who also found that he had gone insane. This left Judge Smith with a previously undecided legal issue as to whether a man who has gone insane can be sentenced after the verdict was received, but before he was actually formally sentenced, could actually be sentenced because he was incompetent to understand the proceedings going on in front of him. After several arguments, briefing of the issue, Judge Smith concluded that despite John having become insane, he was required to impose the sentence of life in prison in the Indiana State Prison. However, the same day he imposed that, Governor Durbin, Indiana governor at the time, known as a progressive governor in many respects, sent the letter on the left that I found in the Indiana archives that ordered that John be not sent to prison and that a formal order would follow, which did the next day on April 19, 1904. The typed order on the right, again from the archives, paroled John to the East Haven Mental Asylum until cured, after which, once he was cured, if ever, he was to be returned to state prison to serve his sentence. So John was never taken to the state prison. Instead, he was taken to East Haven Asylum, which later became the Richmond State Hospital. Then, remember that typo I told you about? Well, that pops up again here. On November 5, 1905, nearly 3 years after John's trial, the Indiana Supreme Court issued its decision and addressed only one issue, and that was the typo that was in the indictment. The Supreme Court determined that typo was it said that the typo in the indictment meant that John was indicted for a crime on an impossible date, and consequently the conviction was reversed. After a 3-week trial, 150 witnesses, it was all reversed on a single typographical error. John was no longer a convicted murderer, but he was not a free man. So the question raged around the state: was John really insane? After the decision, it was indicated he would still remain in the asylum. He was then re-indicted for the murder. The dispute over his sanity continued. Judge Irwin, who's special judge in the case, went on a trip to the asylum and determined that John was viciously insane. Reports persisted over the years about his daughter visiting him, but that he was still crazy. Then John wrote a letter accusing the institution of mishandling inmates and him, particularly because he was an atheist, and the director of the asylum was offended by that and therefore would not let John out, even though he was not insane. That was investigated. by a Catholic priest appointed by the governor to investigate. He also found Terrell was still insane. But in 1908, in about September of 1908, without notice, the superintendent of the institution released John on the basis that there was nothing more they could do for him. Even though they did not meet, he did not say that he met the condition of having been cured. Since he had already been re-indicted, he was rearrested immediately, was not ever free, taken back to the Wells County Jail, where he spent the next 6 months. But finally, the judges, the lawyers involved in the case, the officials who were having to pay for John, his housing in the jail, all reached the decision that it was not accomplishing anything to keep him in jail when he couldn't stand trial. And so in the spring of 1909, he was released on a $15,000 bond. Note, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but at that time, it's the equivalent of about $500,000. So John was released at that time. Just a note that as I did the book, I continued to research on the insanity defense, on insane asylums, Nellie Bly and her 10 days in a New York insane asylum, yellow journalism, turn of the century atheism and religious tolerance or intolerance. That played a big part in the trial because his atheism did come out at the trial and was repeatedly referred to in testimony. And of course, it also turn of the century opiate addiction. So the last thing I want to talk about very briefly here, but when you're doing research, your genealogy research, don't forget the places involved. You can still visit places where people live. There is nothing that puts your story in perspective like looking on the world from the same place as did the people in your story, to trod on the same ground, to touch the same earth, to feel the same wind upon your face. There is the courtroom, the courthouse where the trial actually took place. The courtroom where next Thursday I will be doing a presentation about the trial specifically. Petroleum, Indiana, the Wolfe House, the Terrell House. This is that bustling town of Petroleum. That's what it's like today. The Wolfe House, the Wolfe Farm. That's the property where the Wolfe Farm was located. The house is no longer there, but the property is still there in the area where you can see where the house was. This is the church in a little crossroads of Domestic. That is the church where Melvin Wolfe's funeral took, the actual church where Melvin Wolfe's funeral took place in 1903, where there were more than 300 carriages and buggies surrounding that church from people who attended the funeral. This is the roadside, now Highway 1, Indiana Highway 1. That's the precise location in front of John Terrell's house where he jumped from a ditch and shot a passing carriage with Melvin Wolfe in it. And that, which I confirmed, I did some of my own research, and then I actually hired a title company just to double check it. That is the actual house where John Terrell's family lived during the entire time that this incident took place. And then there are the cemeteries too. This was the tragic story of three people: John, Lucy, and Melvin. And it ends where all stories end. John's grave, Lucy, and Melvin. Okay. Have some upcoming presentations if any of you want to take notes on those. And thank you very much.
What advice do you have for people who are looking to start writing their stories?
That is a difficult question, because it depends so much on the story. I've written novels, I've written other things, but where I started writing isn't where I finished. I started writing the story going all the way back to when the Terrells first came to Indiana. And then I changed that. And then I tried writing it more of as a point of view, telling the story from different people's points of view. And it took about 3 times, probably 60, 70 pages that went in the trash before I settled on the way that I wrote the story. And I'm very pleased with it. However, when I wrote the story, I did not write it with footnotes. And when I went to the publisher, ended up with a very great group at Kent State University Press, but they required footnotes. And so I had to go back and look at my research, and it wasn't as big a project as it could have been, but I ended up having to create 475 endnotes. It ended up in the book. Some of that material taken out of the text of the story. So I think there is, so the best way to do it is that you need to write. You need to know that your first draft doesn't have to be good. It just has to be done. And that a lot of working on this comes after the first draft is done.
That's good advice. Thank you. So I think that'll finish us up for this evening. Just wanted to mention if anybody would like a copy of the chat, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info and we'll send that to you. So thank you again for presenting, and thank you to everybody for attending. All right, bye-bye.
Good night.